The wedding cake collapsed into crimson-stained ruins as Malven Corraith clutched his throat, his expensive black suit torn and bloodied from his violent convulsions. Around the gilded dining hall of Ironcliff Manor, 7 members of the Corraith family writhed in synchronized agony, while 43 wedding guests screamed in horror. Mirelle Corvane, the bride in her pearl-white gown, was the first to fall, her bouquet of desert roses scattering across polished oak floors like funeral petals. This is the story of how one kitchen slave's calculated revenge transformed the most celebrated wedding in Colorado territory into a mass grave, and sent shockwaves through the mining camps of Silverpoint Valley that miners still whisper about in darkened saloons today. Thessia Mornel stood motionless in the servants' entrance between the kitchen and dining hall, her flour-dusted apron pristine, watching the carnage unfold with coal-black eyes that revealed nothing but the satisfaction of perfect timing and flawless execution. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The grandfather clock in Ironcliff Manor's marble entrance hall struck 3:17 on the afternoon of June 12, 1852, its brass chimes echoing through halls that would soon fill with screams. The scent of wild mountain roses from the estate's prized gardens mixed with the rich aroma of roasted venison and something else entirely, a bitter metallic tang that hung in the air like an approaching thunderstorm. Malven Corraith raised his crystal champagne flute high above the assembled crowd, his weathered face beaming with the satisfaction of a man who had carved an empire from Colorado's unforgiving mountains. Around him, 43 of the territory's most prominent citizens waited in anticipation, their silk gowns and tailored coats a stark contrast to the rough-hewn timber and iron fixtures that decorated the mining magnate's fortress-like home. To my son Arendor and his beautiful bride Mirelle, Corraith's voice boomed across the dining hall. May their union be as enduring as the silver veins that flow through Silverpoint Valley and as precious as the gold that built this house. The toast never finished. Mirelle Corvane collapsed first, her pearl-white wedding gown billowing around her convulsing form as she struck the polished oak floor with a sickening thud. Her bouquet of desert roses scattered like drops of blood across the wood, their red petals mixing with the foam that had begun to form at the corners of her mouth. The crystal champagne flute shattered against the floor, its contents spreading in a puddle that reflected the horrified faces of guests who had not yet realized their own fate. Arendor Valcrest lunged toward his bride, but his legs betrayed him before he could reach her side. The young man's body contorted in violent spasms, his hands clawing at his throat as if trying to tear away invisible chains. His father, still holding his own glass, watched in growing horror as his heir writhed on the floor beside his new wife, both of them producing sounds that no human throat should ever make. The realization struck the elder Corraith like a pickaxe to the skull, the champagne, the wedding cake, the elaborate feast that had been prepared in his own kitchens by servants he had trusted for years. Someone had poisoned the entire celebration. But even as understanding dawned, Malven felt his own body beginning to betray him. The crystal flute slipped from his fingers, adding its destruction to the chaos spreading across his dining hall like wildfire through dry timber. His vision blurred, his chest tightened, and the taste of almonds filled his mouth with the bitter promise of death. One by one, the Corraith family members succumbed to whatever toxin had contaminated their celebration. Jonas Thalvin, Malven's younger brother and business partner, collapsed beside the mahogany sideboard where he had been reaching for more wine. Orlith Danevar, Malven's sister who had traveled from Denver for the wedding, fell face first into the 3-tiered cake, her expensive hat decorated with ostrich feathers, now covered in vanilla frosting and her own blood. The wedding guests who had not yet partaken of the feast pressed themselves against the walls, their faces pale with terror, as they watched Colorado Territory's most powerful mining family destroy itself in minutes of synchronized agony. Some tried to flee toward the exits, but found their way blocked by servants who stood like sentinels, preventing anyone from leaving until the spectacle had run its course. Through it all, Thessia Mornel remained perfectly still in the doorway between kitchen and dining hall, her coal-black eyes taking in every detail of the carnage she had orchestrated with the precision of a master craftsman. Her flour-dusted apron remained spotless, her dark hair pulled back in the same severe bun she had worn every day for the past 6 years. To the panicked guests, she appeared to be just another servant, frozen in shock by the tragedy unfolding before her. But Thessia felt no shock. She felt only the cold satisfaction of a plan executed to perfection. The wedding cake, a towering masterpiece of sugar and flour that had taken her 3 days to construct, lay in ruins beneath Orlith's lifeless body. Each layer had been infused with carefully measured doses of poison extracted from the foxglove that grew wild in the mountain meadows surrounding the estate. The champagne, imported at enormous expense from France, had been doctored with bitter almonds ground so fine they dissolved completely in the alcohol. Even the roses decorating each table carried traces of oleander sap on their thorns, ensuring that anyone who handled them carelessly would absorb enough toxin to guarantee their participation in the day's festivities. Dr. Fendril Caro, who had been seated at the head table as an honored guest, stumbled toward his medical bag with the desperate urgency of a man who understood exactly what he was witnessing. His hands shook as he fumbled with the leather clasps, his own vision beginning to blur from the small amount of champagne he had consumed during the initial toast. The physician had attended enough mining accidents and frontier violence to recognize the signs of systematic poisoning, but the scope and coordination required for such an attack left him reeling. "Someone fetch the sheriff," Dr. Caro commanded, his voice cracking with the effort of remaining professional while his own body fought against the toxins coursing through his bloodstream. This was no accident. This was murder. But even as he spoke, the doctor realized the futility of his request. Sheriff Ulrich van Rohe lay sprawled beneath one of the dining tables, his badge of office glinting in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through tall windows. The lawman had consumed more champagne than most, having known the Corraith family since his arrival in Silverpoint Valley 5 years earlier. The guests who remained conscious began to understand that they were trapped in a death house with a killer who had planned every detail of their destruction. Some prayed, others wept, but most simply stared in horrified fascination, as Colorado Territory's ruling family paid the ultimate price for crimes that would never see the inside of a courtroom. Thessia allowed herself the smallest of smiles as she watched Malven Corraith draw his final breath. The man who had owned her body and soul for 6 brutal years now lay broken on the floor of his own dining hall, surrounded by the wealth he had built on the suffering of others. His mining empire, his political connections, his social standing, none of it could save him from the justice that had been brewing in his own kitchen. The clock struck 3:47, marking exactly 30 minutes since the toast that had begun the Corraith family's final meal. In that time, 7 people had died, and Colorado Territory's most powerful dynasty had been reduced to corpses decorating their own wedding celebration. But this was only the beginning of a story that would reshape how people understood the relationship between masters and servants in the American West. Before we dive deeper into this dark chapter of Colorado Territory history, I need to know something about you, the person watching this right now. Where are you sitting as you hear about Thessia Mornel's calculated revenge? Are you in your bedroom late at night, scrolling through your phone while the rest of your family sleeps? Maybe you're taking a break from work, trying to distract yourself from your own daily struggles with a story about someone who refused to accept her circumstances. What time is it where you are right now? Drop a comment below and let me know your location and the current time. I'm genuinely curious about when and where people choose to explore these hidden corners of American history. These stories that textbooks never tell because they reveal uncomfortable truths about the foundations our society was built upon. The story of Thessia Mornel and the Ironcliff Manor massacre represents something much larger than a single act of revenge. It's a window into a world where human beings were treated as property, where violence against workers was considered a normal part of doing business, and where the legal system existed primarily to protect the interests of those wealthy enough to own it. But it's also a story about resistance, about what happens when people push beyond their breaking point, discover that they possess knowledge and skills their oppressors never suspected. Thessia wasn't just a kitchen worker who snapped under pressure. She was part of something bigger, something that would challenge everything we think we know about power dynamics in the American frontier. Over the next hour, we're going to uncover evidence that suggests the Ironcliff Manor poisonings were not an isolated incident. We'll explore documents that reveal systematic abuse, coordinated resistance networks, and a level of planning that required resources and knowledge far beyond what a single enslaved woman could have possessed on her own. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You're going to learn about the Underground Railroad's western branch, which operated very differently from its more famous eastern counterpart. Instead of helping people escape to freedom, it helped them stay in place while building the skills and networks necessary to fight back against their oppressors from within. We'll examine mining company records that show patterns of suspicious deaths among Colorado's wealthy elite, deaths that were always attributed to natural causes or unfortunate accidents. We'll discover how botanical knowledge passed down through indigenous and immigrant communities became weaponized against the very people who sought to erase those cultures. Most importantly, we'll explore the moral questions that Thessia's story forces us to confront. When legal systems fail to protect the innocent, when economic structures depend on exploitation, when those in power refuse to acknowledge the humanity of those they control, what obligations do the oppressed have to seek justice through other means? These aren't comfortable questions, and the answers aren't simple, but they're questions that remain relevant today, in a world where economic inequality continues to grow, and where many people feel that traditional institutions no longer serve their interests. The story you're about to hear will challenge your assumptions about good and evil, about justice and revenge, about what ordinary people are capable of when they decide that enough is enough. It will make you question whether Thessia Mornel was a cold-blooded killer or a freedom fighter, whether the Corraith family got what they deserved or were victims of an unforgivable crime. But here's what I promise you. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why miners in Colorado still refuse to speak the name Thessia Mornel aloud. You'll know why Ironcliff Manor stood empty for decades after the massacre, why no amount of money could convince workers to set foot on the property. You'll discover why some people believe her spirit still walks the mountain passes around Silverpoint Valley, ensuring that those who profit from others' suffering never feel completely safe. This isn't just history. It's a map of how power really works, how resistance movements develop in the shadows, and how individual acts of defiance can reshape entire societies. The techniques Thessia used, the network she was part of, the knowledge she possessed, all of these elements continue to influence how people organize against oppression today. So settle in, because we're about to take a journey into one of the American West's most carefully guarded secrets. We're going to meet the woman who brought down Colorado's most powerful family using nothing but plants, patience, and the kind of rage that burns cold and clean for years before it finally erupts into action. And if you stick around until the end, you'll discover why some historians believe that Thessia Mornel never actually died, why there are reports of similar incidents throughout the Western territories that bear her signature methods, and why the techniques she perfected in the Corraith kitchen continue to surface in resistance movements across the world. The story of the Ironcliff Manor massacre is about to change how you see power, justice, and the hidden history of American expansion. Are you ready to discover what really happened when the frontier's most dangerous woman decided it was time for the Corraith family to pay for their crimes? The clock is ticking, and the poison is already in the wine. The Colorado Territory of 1852 existed as a brutal frontier where fortunes were carved from mountainsides with pickaxes and explosives, where silver and gold transformed desperate men into instant aristocrats, and where the rules of civilized society bent to accommodate whatever violence was necessary to extract wealth from an unforgiving landscape. Silverpoint Valley stretched across 30 miles of the most mineral-rich territory in North America, a jagged scar through the Rocky Mountains, where underground streams ran silver and veins of gold threaded through granite like metallic spiderwebs. The valley had been home to Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples for generations before white prospectors arrived in the late 1840s, bringing with them diseases, violence, and an insatiable hunger for the precious metals that lay beneath sacred hunting grounds. By 1852, the indigenous peoples had been driven from their ancestral lands through a combination of military force, deliberate contamination of water sources, and systematic destruction of the buffalo herds that sustained their traditional way of life. In their place rose mining camps that grew into towns almost overnight, ramshackle collections of tents and wooden buildings that housed the thousands of workers necessary to extract Colorado's mineral wealth. At the center of this transformation stood Ironcliff Manor, a fortress-like structure built into the mountainside itself, its walls constructed from the same granite that contained the silver veins that had made the Corraith family wealthy beyond measure. The manor commanded a view of the entire valley, its windows positioned to overlook the dozen mining operations that fed the family's ever-growing fortune. Malven Corraith had arrived in Colorado Territory in 1847 with nothing but a pickaxe, a mule, and the kind of ruthless determination that frontier wealth required. Within 5 years, he had consolidated control over the most productive mines in the region through a combination of legitimate business deals, political corruption, and the kind of violence that territorial law enforcement was either unwilling or unable to address. The Corraith Mining Corporation employed over 800 workers across its various operations, a workforce that included Irish immigrants fleeing the potato famine, Chinese laborers who had completed work on the Transcontinental Railroad, freed blacks seeking opportunities in the territories, and enslaved people who had been brought west by their owners to work in conditions that made southern plantations seem hospitable by comparison. Labor conditions in the Corraith mines represented a new form of industrial slavery that combined the worst aspects of traditional bondage with the additional dangers of underground mining. Workers descended into shafts that were poorly ventilated and inadequately supported, using tools and techniques that prioritized speed over safety. Cave-ins, explosions, and toxic gas exposure killed an average of 1 worker per week across the Corraith operations, deaths that were recorded in company ledgers as business expenses rather than human tragedies. The legal system that governed Colorado Territory had been designed by and for men like Malven Corraith. Territorial law recognized several categories of workers: free whites, who possessed full legal rights but little economic power; immigrants, who had limited legal standing and could be deported at will; and enslaved people, who remained property under territorial statute regardless of their skills or economic value. This legal framework created a hierarchy of exploitation that allowed mining companies to extract maximum value from human labor while minimizing their legal and financial obligations to the people who generated their wealth. Free workers could be fired and blacklisted for organizing or complaining about conditions. Immigrant workers could be deported if they caused trouble. Enslaved workers had no legal recourse whatsoever. The Corraith household reflected this broader social structure and microcosm. Ironcliff Manor employed 12 house servants, 6 stable hands, 8 groundskeepers, and a kitchen staff of 4, all of whom lived in quarters built into the mountainside beneath the main house. Their living conditions varied according to their legal status and perceived value to the family's operations. Free servants received small wages and were allowed to live in town when not working. Immigrant workers were housed in dormitory-style quarters and paid in company scrip that could only be spent at Corraith-owned stores. Enslaved workers like Thessia lived in underground chambers carved directly from the granite, spaces that remained cold and damp regardless of the season. The kitchen where Thessia worked had been designed to support elaborate entertaining on a scale that demonstrated the Corraith family's wealth and social standing. The main preparation area could accommodate the cooking requirements for gatherings of up to 100 guests. With multiple wood-burning stoves, extensive cold storage carved into the mountainside, and specialized areas for baking, butchering, and food preservation. This kitchen became Thessia's domain and her laboratory, a space where she learned not only the culinary skills necessary to satisfy the refined tastes of Colorado's mining elite, but also the botanical and chemical knowledge that would eventually allow her to transform a wedding celebration into a mass execution. The mountains surrounding Silverpoint Valley contained a rich variety of plant life, much of it unknown to the European settlers who had claimed the territory but well understood by the indigenous peoples who had been driven from their lands. Many of these plants possessed medicinal properties when properly prepared but could become deadly when concentrated or combined in specific ways. Thessia's education in these botanical arts came not from formal instruction, but from informal networks of knowledge that existed among the valley's diverse population of workers. Chinese miners brought understanding of herbs and toxins from traditional medicine. Indigenous women who worked as laundresses and seamstresses shared knowledge of local plants and their properties. African Americans, both free and enslaved, contributed expertise developed on southern plantations, where botanical knowledge had meant the difference between healing and harming. This informal education network operated beneath the notice of the valley's white elite, who viewed their workers as interchangeable sources of labor rather than individuals with specialized knowledge and skills. The Corraith family never suspected that their kitchen slave was accumulating expertise that would eventually threaten their very existence. The wedding of Arindor Valcrest to Mirelle Corvane represented more than a social celebration. It was a political and economic alliance designed to consolidate control over Colorado Territory's mineral wealth. The bride's family controlled several smaller mining operations that the Corraiths had been seeking to acquire, while the groom brought connections to banking interests in Denver and political influence in the territorial legislature. The guest list for the wedding read like a directory of Colorado Territory's power structure: mine owners, territorial officials, banking representatives, railroad executives, and military contractors who supplied the Army units responsible for maintaining order in the mining camps. These were the people who had carved the territory's economy from granite and human suffering, who had created the legal and social structures that made their wealth possible. By poisoning the wedding celebration, Thessia was striking not just at the Corraith family but at the entire system of exploitation that had made their wealth possible. Her targets represented every aspect of territorial power: economic, political, legal, and military. In a single afternoon, she eliminated some of the most influential people in Colorado Territory. But the scope and precision of her attack suggested coordination and resources that went far beyond what a single kitchen worker could have assembled independently. Someone had been planning this operation for months, possibly years. Someone with detailed knowledge of the guests who would be attending, the security arrangements that would be in place, and the investigative procedures that would follow the discovery of mass murder. As we'll discover, Thessia Mornel was not acting alone. Thessia Mornel had not always been a killer. She had been born free in the mountains of North Carolina, the daughter of a Cherokee mother and a Scottish father who had built a small but prosperous trading post where indigenous and white communities conducted business in relative peace. Her earliest memories were of safety, of parents who loved her, and of a world where her mixed heritage was seen as a bridge between two cultures rather than a source of shame or danger. That world ended when she was 14 years old. Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act had reached even the most remote mountain communities by 1838, and federal troops arrived at the Mornel trading post, with orders to relocate all persons of Cherokee descent to designated territories west of the Mississippi River. Thessia's mother, Calith Dromere, attempted to explain that her daughter was only half Cherokee, that the family had legal ownership of their land, that they had never participated in any conflicts with white settlers. The soldiers were not interested in such distinctions. Thessia watched from hiding as her mother was forced at gunpoint into a wagon with dozens of other Cherokee families, beginning the journey that history would remember as the Trail of Tears. Her father, Draven Thorsell, tried to follow but was beaten unconscious by soldiers who informed him that white men who consorted with Indian women had forfeited their rights to protection under federal law. By the time Drivon recovered from his injuries, the Cherokee removal convoy had disappeared into the western wilderness. He spent the next 2 years searching for his wife and eventually died of exhaustion and heartbreak somewhere in the Arkansas Territory, leaving Thessia completely alone at 16, with nothing but the ruins of her family's trading post. The teenager, who had once been protected by two loving parents, now found herself vulnerable to every form of exploitation that frontier society could devise. She was too Indian to be fully accepted by white communities, too white to find shelter among the few Cherokee who had managed to avoid removal, and too female to survive independently in a landscape where violence was the primary means of resolving disputes. Thessia's descent into slavery began gradually, through a series of circumstances that seemed reasonable at the time, but ultimately trapped her in a system designed to extract maximum value from human desperation. A white family in Tennessee offered her shelter in exchange for domestic work, promising to treat her like family, while she earned money to search for her mother. The promises proved false, but by the time Thessia understood the deception, she was already trapped by debt bondage that made escape impossible. The family charged her for food, shelter, and clothing at inflated prices, while paying wages that could never cover her manufactured expenses. When she tried to leave, they had her arrested for theft of services and sentenced to additional years of unpaid labor. By 1846, Thessia had been sold 3 times to cover her supposed debts, moving progressively westward as her owners sought new opportunities in the expanding territories. Each sale moved her further from any hope of finding her mother and deeper into forms of bondage that had no legal remedies and no expiration dates. Malven Corraith purchased Thessia in Denver during the winter of 1846, paying $400 for a young woman whose skills included cooking, cleaning, basic medical care, and fluency in both English and Cherokee languages. The mining magnate had been seeking kitchen staff capable of preparing the elaborate meals necessary to entertain the political and business contacts who were essential to his expanding operations. Thessia's arrival at Ironcliff Manor marked the beginning of 6 years of systematic brutalization that would transform a grieving teenager into a calculating instrument of revenge. The Corraith family's treatment of their enslaved workers went beyond the routine cruelties that frontier society considered normal business practice, evolving into forms of recreational sadism that served no economic purpose beyond the entertainment value they provided to bored aristocrats. Mirelle Corvane, who would eventually become Arendor's bride, had been a frequent guest at Ironcliff Manor since 1848 and had developed her own particular interests in the creative punishment of household workers. The young woman took special pleasure in designing humiliations that exploited Thessia's mixed heritage, forcing her to dress in stereotypical Indian costumes during dinner parties where guests would make jokes about savage behavior and primitive intelligence. But it was the systematic destruction of Thessia's connections to her Cherokee identity that inflicted the deepest wounds. Mirelle discovered that Thessia had managed to preserve a few items from her childhood: a beaded necklace her mother had made, a small medicine bag containing herbs from their mountain home, and a wooden flute her father had carved during her 10th birthday. These items became tools of torture. Mirelle would force Thessia to watch as she slowly burned the beadwork, grain by grain, while describing in detail the deaths of Cherokee families during the removal process. The medicine bag was emptied into chamber pots, its sacred contents mixed with human waste, while Mirelle explained that this was the proper place for savage superstitions in a Christian household. The wooden flute suffered the cruelest fate of all. Mirelle broke it into small pieces that she forced Thessia to eat, one fragment per day, until the instrument her father had made with loving hands had been completely consumed by his daughter's humiliated body. These psychological tortures were accompanied by physical abuse that left permanent scars on both Thessia's body and her understanding of human nature. Malven Corraith had discovered that certain forms of violence could be disguised as legitimate discipline, allowing him to satisfy sadistic impulses while maintaining the fiction that he was simply maintaining order among his household staff. Burns were common, usually attributed to kitchen accidents that occurred when Thessia was supposedly careless around cooking fires. The scars on her hands and forearms told a different story, forming patterns that suggested deliberate application of heated metal objects rather than random contact with stoves or ovens. Starvation was another favored punishment, justified by claims that enslaved workers who ate too much became lazy and unreliable. Thessia's weight dropped dramatically during her first year at Ironcliff Manor, and she learned to supplement her inadequate food rations by eating plants and roots she gathered during her brief periods outside the house. This foraging for survival became the foundation of her botanical education, as she discovered which mountain plants were safe to eat and which possessed properties that could affect human health in more dramatic ways. The knowledge that would eventually allow her to poison the Corraith family began as a desperate attempt to keep herself alive on the inadequate nutrition her owners provided. But perhaps the most damaging aspect of Thessia's experience was the complete absence of legal recourse for the crimes being committed against her. Territorial law not only failed to protect enslaved people from violence, it actively criminalized any attempts at self-defense or resistance. Striking back against an owner was attempted murder, regardless of the circumstances. Running away was theft of services that could result in additional years of bondage. This legal framework meant that Thessia's only options were submission or death, unless she could find ways to resist that operated completely outside the official systems of justice and law enforcement. Her education in poison was not just about botany. It was about finding forms of power that existed beyond the reach of courts and legislatures controlled by men like Malven Corraith. The decision to kill the entire Corraith family during Arendor's wedding was not made impulsively, in a moment of rage or desperation. It was the culmination of years of careful planning, during which Thessia systematically acquired the knowledge, resources, and connections necessary to eliminate not just her immediate tormentors, but the entire network of wealth and power they represented. By June 1852, Thessia had become something unprecedented in the American West, an enslaved woman who possessed the skills and determination necessary to wage war against the system that claimed to own her soul. Marshal Mirelle Corvane's horse struck sparks against the granite road, leading to Ironcliff Manor, as word of the massacre reached his office in the territorial capital of Golden Valley. The leather saddlebags bouncing against his mount's flanks carried the investigative tools that had made him the territory's most respected lawman: magnifying glasses imported from Boston, chemical testing supplies obtained from Denver's Medical College, and a collection of forensic manuals that represented the cutting edge of criminal investigation techniques. But Corvane's 23 years of experience pursuing killers across the Western Territories had never prepared him for a crime scene like the one awaiting him in the Corraith dining hall. The marshal arrived at 6:30 in the evening on June 12, 1852, accompanied by Deputy Lorian Dravik and Dr. Thessia Mornel, the territory's only physician, with formal training in the identification of poisons and toxins. The 3-hour ride from Golden Valley had given them time to discuss the preliminary reports, but nothing could have prepared them for the scope of carnage they discovered inside Malven Corraith's mountain fortress. 7 bodies lay scattered across the dining hall in positions that told the story of synchronized death. The Corraith family patriarch remained seated in his chair at the head of the table, his upper body slumped forward into a pool of his own blood. Crystal champagne flute still clutched in fingers that had grown rigid with rigor mortis. His son Arendor lay crumpled beside his bride's chair, one arm extended toward Mirelle as if he had been trying to reach her during his final moments. The bride herself presented the most disturbing sight of all. Mirelle Corvane had fallen backward into the 3-tiered wedding cake, her white gown now stained with vanilla frosting, blood, and the dried foam that had poured from her mouth during the final stages of her poisoning. Her bouquet of desert roses lay scattered around her body, the red petals forming patterns that looked disturbingly deliberate to Marshal Corvane's experienced eye. Dr. Halcourt immediately began examining the bodies while Deputy Dravik interviewed the surviving guests, who remained huddled in groups throughout the manor's various rooms. The physician's initial findings confirmed what the marshal had suspected from the moment he received word of multiple simultaneous deaths. This had been a carefully orchestrated mass poisoning that required both extensive botanical knowledge and access to the family's food preparation areas. The symptoms described by witnesses painted a clear picture of cardiac glycoside poisoning, most likely derived from foxglove or oleander plants that grew wild throughout the Colorado mountains. But the coordination required to poison multiple food and beverage sources simultaneously suggested planning that went far beyond the capabilities of a single individual acting alone. From Marshal Mirelle Corvane's official investigation report June 13, 1852, the precision timing of the deaths, combined with the variety of delivery methods employed, indicates a conspiracy involving multiple perpetrators with detailed knowledge of the victims, dietary habits, and social customs. This was not a crime of passion, but a calculated execution carried out by individuals who possessed both technical expertise and extensive inside information about the Corraith household operations. The most troubling discovery came when Deputy Dravik began interviewing the manor's household staff. 14 servants had been present during the wedding celebration, positioned throughout the building to manage food service, guest assistance, and security functions. Yet not one of them reported seeing anything suspicious during the hours leading up to the poisoning. Even more disturbing was the staff's collective response to questioning about the missing kitchen worker. When asked about Thessia Mornel's whereabouts, each servant provided essentially the same answer. She had left the previous morning to visit a sick relative in a mining camp 30 miles away, and her absence had been approved by the household manager. The story was too consistent, too perfectly coordinated to be truthful. Marshal Corvane had interrogated enough criminals to recognize the signs of rehearsed deception, but the discipline displayed by the Corraith servants suggested organizational skills that went far beyond anything he had encountered in previous frontier crime investigations. Dr. Halcourt's examination of the crime scene provided additional evidence of sophisticated planning. The poison had been delivered through multiple vectors: the champagne used for the wedding toast, the vanilla frosting on the cake, and even the water used to arrange the table's floral displays. Each delivery method had been precisely calibrated to ensure lethal dosing while avoiding detection until consumption was complete. The chemical analysis equipment Dr. Halcourt had brought from Denver confirmed the presence of cardiac glycosides in all the contaminated substances, but also revealed something unexpected. The poison concentrations varied according to each victim's position at the table. Malven Corraith, as the head of the family, had received the highest dose through his champagne. Mirelle, as the guest of honor, had been given a moderate but certainly fatal amount through the cake frosting. Other family members had received varying concentrations that corresponded exactly to their importance within the family hierarchy. This level of precision required detailed knowledge of the seating arrangements, the order in which different foods would be consumed, and the specific amounts each individual was likely to eat or drink. Such information could only have come from someone with intimate access to the family's domestic routines and social customs. From Dr. Vasira Halcourt's forensic analysis, June 14, 1852, the perpetrator demonstrates mastery of botanical chemistry equivalent to formal pharmaceutical training. The poison concentrations have been calculated with mathematical precision, suggesting access to scales, measuring equipment, and reference materials that would not normally be available to domestic servants. This crime required both extensive preparation time and laboratory-quality facilities. The search for Thessia Mornel began immediately, but Mirelle Corvane quickly discovered that tracking a fugitive through Colorado's mountain wilderness presented unique challenges. The territory contained thousands of square miles of unmapped terrain, dozens of mining camps where strangers could disappear without question, and well-established networks of people who had their own reasons for avoiding contact with territorial law enforcement. More troubling still was the complete absence of physical evidence that could be traced to the missing kitchen worker. Thessia's quarters beneath the manor had been thoroughly cleaned, with no trace of poison preparation materials, botanical specimens, or personal belongings that might indicate her plans or destination. Even her clothing was missing, suggesting that her departure had been planned well in advance. The efficiency of this evidence removal indicated coordination with other individuals who possessed detailed knowledge of criminal investigation procedures. Someone had known exactly what material to remove and how to clean the workspace to eliminate forensic evidence. This was not the work of a desperate slave fleeing an impulsive crime, but part of a carefully orchestrated operation designed to ensure the perpetrator's escape. Deputy Dravik's interviews with neighboring mining operations revealed additional disturbing patterns. 3 other wealthy families in Silverpoint Valley had experienced unexpected deaths within the past 18 months, all attributed to natural causes or unfortunate accidents. The Thalvin family had lost their patriarch to apparent heart failure during a holiday dinner. The Venro mining operation had suffered a cave-in that killed the owner and 2 of his adult sons. The Cresttown trading post had burned down with the entire family inside, an incident attributed to a carelessly maintained stove. When examined individually, each incident seemed like the kind of tragedy that frontier life made commonplace. But viewed together, they formed a pattern that suggested systematic targeting of the valley's most powerful and ruthless business leaders. Someone had been waging a quiet war against Colorado Territory's ruling class, using methods so subtle that the crimes had gone unrecognized until the Corraith massacre forced investigators to look for connections. The implications were staggering. If these incidents were related, then Colorado Territory was dealing not with a single killer, but with an organized resistance movement capable of eliminating wealthy targets while making their deaths appear natural. The technical skills and coordination required for such operations suggested resources and leadership that posed a fundamental threat to the territorial power structure. Mirelle Corvane's investigation was about to uncover a conspiracy that reached far beyond a single act of revenge by a kitchen slave. He was pursuing people who had weaponized botanical knowledge, turned domestic service into espionage, and created networks of resistance that operated completely outside the official legal system. But even as the marshal expanded his investigation, he was being watched by individuals who had been planning for this moment since long before Thessia Mornel poisoned the Corraith family's wedding cake. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The mountain mist rolled down from Silverpoint Peak like smoke from a funeral pyre, carrying with it the scent of pine, and something else entirely, the metallic taste of secrets that had been buried too shallow and were beginning to surface. Marshal Mirelle Corvane stood in the doorway of what had been Thessia Mornel's quarters beneath Ironcliff Manor, studying a space so thoroughly cleaned that it seemed to gleam in the lamplight. 3 days had passed since the massacre, and every investigative technique Corvane had learned during his decades of frontier law enforcement had failed to produce a single useful lead. Thessia had vanished as completely as if the Colorado mountains had swallowed her whole, leaving behind no trace of her presence beyond the 7 corpses decorating the Corraith dining hall. The underground chamber carved from living granite showed no evidence that anyone had ever lived there. No personal belongings, no hidden caches of poison-making materials, no letters or documents that might indicate connections to other people or places. Even the straw mattress had been replaced with fresh materials that bore no trace of human occupation. Someone had spent considerable time ensuring that this room would tell investigators nothing about its former occupant. Dr. Vezira Halcourt knelt beside the chamber's single window, a narrow opening that provided minimal natural light during daylight hours. Her magnifying glass revealed scratches on the granite windowsill that suggested repeated use of metal tools, but the marks had been deliberately obscured with stone dust and appeared to be weeks or months old. Someone has been preparing escape routes from this room for a considerable period, Dr. Halcourt reported, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. These tool marks indicate systematic work to widen the window opening, probably to allow passage of a full-grown person, but the modifications were completed well before the wedding massacre, suggesting long-term planning rather than desperate improvisation. Deputy Lorian Dravak emerged from his search of the manor's extensive cellars and storage areas with equally frustrating results. Every space that might have concealed poison-making materials had been thoroughly cleaned and reorganized. The root cellars contained only legitimate food storage. The wine cellars showed no evidence of tampering with their valuable contents. Even the coal storage areas had been swept clean of any botanical specimens or chemical residues. "It's like she was never here," Dravak reported, frustration evident in his voice. "Or like someone wanted us to think she was never here." Either way, we're dealing with people who understand exactly how territorial investigations operate and have planned accordingly. But it was the behavior of the surviving household staff that provided the most disturbing evidence of coordinated deception. Mirelle Corvane had interviewed each of the 14 servants multiple times over 3 days, and their stories remained absolutely consistent down to the smallest details. Thessia had left the manor on the morning of June 11th to visit her ailing cousin at the Broken Creek mining camp. She had received permission from the household manager. She had taken no personal belongings because she planned to return within a few days. The problem was that Broken Creek had been abandoned for over a year following a cave-in that killed most of its residents. No one lived there anymore, and anyone claiming to visit relatives at that location was either lying or severely misinformed about territorial geography. When Corvane confronted the servants with this information, their responses revealed a level of preparation that chilled him to his core. Each person expressed shock at learning about Broken Creek's abandonment. Each claimed to have been misinformed about Thessia's destination. Each suggested that perhaps she had mentioned a different mining camp, whose name sounded similar. But none of them could explain how they had all been misinformed in exactly the same way, or why their individual recollections of Thessia's departure contained identical details that would have been impossible to coordinate without prior discussion. From Marshal Thera Corvane's investigation notes June 15, 1852, the household staff's testimony demonstrates rehearsal and coordination that requires advanced planning and group organization. These people have been prepared to provide false information about Thessia Mornel's whereabouts, suggesting her escape was part of a larger operation involving multiple conspirators with detailed knowledge of law enforcement procedures. The discovery that fundamentally changed Corvane's understanding of the case came when he expanded his investigation beyond Ironcliff Manor to examine employment records and communication patterns across Silverpoint Valley's various mining operations. What he found challenged every assumption he had made about the scope and sophistication of the conspiracy he was pursuing. Thessia Mornel had not been the only household worker to disappear from prominent families in the weeks leading up to suspicious deaths. The Malven family had lost their head cook 3 days before the patriarch's fatal heart attack. The Van Row mining operation had seen their kitchen manager quit without notice just before the cave-in that killed the owner. The Cresttown Trading Post had experienced the departure of 2 domestic servants in the week before the fire that consumed the entire family. When viewed individually, each departure could be explained as coincidental bad timing or the normal turnover that affected domestic employment in frontier territories. But examined together, they formed a pattern that suggested systematic coordination among household workers across the entire valley. Even more disturbing was the discovery that these departing workers had not simply vanished into the wilderness. Investigation of employment records from surrounding territories revealed that people matching their descriptions had found new positions with other wealthy families in distant locations, often carrying letters of recommendation that praised their skills and reliability. Someone was operating a sophisticated placement service that moved experienced domestic workers between households throughout the Western Territories, ensuring that kitchens and service areas in the homes of prominent families were staffed by individuals whose loyalties might not align with their employers' interests. Dr. Halcourt's expanded analysis of the poison used in the Corraith massacre provided additional evidence of organizational sophistication. The cardiac glycosides had been extracted with a level of chemical purity that required not just botanical knowledge, but access to distillation equipment and measurement tools that would normally be found only in medical or academic facilities. The poison's consistency and concentration suggested mass production rather than individual preparation. Someone was manufacturing these substances in quantity, probably supplying them to multiple operatives for use in coordinated operations against selected targets. This is industrial-scale assassination, Dr. Halcourt reported during a meeting with Mirelle Corvane and territorial officials in Golden Valley. We're not dealing with individual criminals acting independently, but with an organization that possesses resources, technical capabilities, and coordination systems that rival military operations. The implications were staggering for Colorado Territory's power structure. If domestic workers throughout the region were part of an organized resistance movement, then every wealthy household was potentially compromised. The very people who prepared food, managed communications, and overheard private conversations might be gathering intelligence and waiting for orders to eliminate their employers. Even more troubling was the realization that this network had been operating for months or years without detection. The deaths of the Thalvin, Van Roe, and Cresttown families had all been attributed to natural causes or accidents, suggesting that the Corraith massacre might represent an escalation in tactics rather than the beginning of violent resistance. Mirelle Corvane's investigation took a darker turn when he attempted to trace the letters of recommendation that had helped displaced domestic workers find new positions. The documents appeared authentic, complete with official seals and signatures from respected territorial officials, but closer examination revealed sophisticated forgery work that required access to government stationery and detailed knowledge of administrative procedures. Someone with connections inside territorial government was facilitating the movement of potential assassins between households throughout the Western Territories. The conspiracy reached far beyond displaced workers seeking revenge against cruel employers. It involved people with political influence and institutional access who were using their positions to wage war against the region's economic elite. The breakthrough that would reshape Corvane's entire investigation came from an unexpected source, a Chinese miner named Kaylor Vinreth, who worked one of the smaller claims in Silverpoint Valley. Vinreth approached the marshal with information he claimed could explain Thessia Mornel's disappearance, but only if he received guarantees of protection from retaliation. The miner's story revealed the existence of an underground network that connected immigrant communities throughout Colorado Territory, a communication system that allowed information and people to move across vast distances without leaving traces that territorial authorities could follow. The mountain people, they know things, Vinreth explained in broken English, glancing nervously around the marshal's office. They know when bad things happen to families who hurt workers. They know when someone needs to disappear. They help because they understand that powerful people, they never face justice unless someone makes justice happen. According to Vinreth, Thessia had not fled into the wilderness alone. She had been extracted by a network of indigenous guides, immigrant traders, and displaced workers who operated their own system of trails and safe houses throughout the Rocky Mountains. This network could move people across hundreds of miles of wilderness while avoiding all contact with official law enforcement or territorial authorities. But the most disturbing revelation was yet to come. Vinreth claimed that Thessia's escape had been coordinated with similar evacuations of domestic workers from other households throughout the territory, suggesting that the Corraith massacre was part of a larger operation that had targeted multiple families simultaneously. If this information was accurate, then Mirelle Corvane was not investigating a single mass murder, but the opening phase of a coordinated assault against Colorado Territory's entire power structure. The people he was pursuing possessed resources, organization, and strategic capabilities that posed a fundamental threat to territorial stability. As evening fell over Golden Valley, Marshal Corvane realized that his investigation had uncovered something unprecedented in American frontier history: an organized resistance movement capable of waging systematic war against the economic and political elite who controlled territorial society. But the most unsettling discovery was still to come. Hidden among the papers in Malven Corraith's personal safe, investigators would find evidence that the mining magnate himself had known about the conspiracy that eventually killed him, and had been secretly negotiating with its leaders in the weeks before his death. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, but the full scope of that reversal was only beginning to emerge from the shadows of Colorado's unforgiving mountains. The iron safe in Malven Corraith's private office had withstood the mountain winters and summer heat that tested everything in Colorado territory, its German-manufactured locks and steel construction representing the kind of craftsmanship that money could buy in 1852. But as Marshal Theric Corvane applied the specialized tools he had acquired during his years investigating territorial crimes, the safe's contents would prove more explosive than any dynamite used in the valley's mining operations. The documents hidden behind 3 inches of hardened steel told a story that challenged everything Corvane thought he understood about power, resistance, and the true nature of the conspiracy that had killed Colorado Territory's most influential family. Malven Corraith had not been an innocent victim of his kitchen slave's revenge. He had been a participant in negotiations with the very network that eventually orchestrated his death. The correspondence dated back 18 months, beginning with a single sheet of paper that had been slipped under Corraith's office door during a January blizzard in 1851. The message was brief, written in precise handwriting that suggested formal education. Your treatment of workers has attracted attention from people who believe that justice exists even where law enforcement fails. Changes in your business practices could prevent unfortunate consequences for your family. Subsequent letters revealed an escalating exchange between Corraith and someone who identified themselves only as a friend of the mountain people. The mysterious correspondent demonstrated detailed knowledge of the mining magnate's operations, from the safety violations that killed workers weekly to the financial arrangements that allowed him to avoid territorial oversight of his labor practices. But what made these letters truly disturbing was their tone of reasoned negotiation rather than threatening extortion. The writer offered specific recommendations for improving worker conditions, suggested compensation for families of workers killed in preventable accidents, and even provided detailed proposals for profit-sharing arrangements that would give employees financial stakes in the mining operations they risked their lives to maintain. From the correspondence found in Malven Corraith's safe, dated March 15, 1851, your cooperation in addressing the systemic issues that have made your operations notorious throughout the territory would demonstrate that change is possible without resort to more direct intervention. We prefer negotiation to other methods of resolving disputes, but our patience is not unlimited. Corraith's responses, preserved in draft form among his papers, revealed a man caught between economic pressures and growing awareness that his business practices had made him a target for people whose capabilities he was only beginning to understand. His initial replies were dismissive, treating the correspondence as crude extortion attempts from disgruntled workers who lacked the sophistication to threaten him effectively. But as the months progressed, Corraith's tone shifted from contempt to concern to something approaching genuine fear. His later letters acknowledged receiving demonstrations of his correspondence, capabilities, mining equipment that had been sabotaged with surgical precision, supply shipments that had disappeared without trace, and accidents that had befallen his competitors in ways that seemed suspiciously convenient for his own operations. Dr. Thessia Mornel's analysis of the correspondence revealed even more disturbing implications. The paper used for the mysterious letters came from at least 6 different sources, suggesting coordination among multiple individuals with access to various supplies. The handwriting, while consistent within individual letters, showed subtle variations that indicated different authors working from shared instructions or templates. Most significantly, chemical analysis of the ink revealed traces of minerals that could only be found in specific locations throughout Colorado Territory. The letter dated March 15th contained elements from the area around Golden Valley. The April correspondence showed traces of materials from the mining camps near Broken Creek. A May letter included mineral signatures from the indigenous territories that had been officially evacuated but were still inhabited by people who refused to acknowledge territorial authority. These people are operating across the entire region. Dr. Halcourt reported to Mirelle Corvane during their evening meeting in Golden Valley. The correspondence indicates coordination between groups in separated geographic areas, with communication systems that allow them to share information and coordinate activities across hundreds of miles of wilderness. Deputy Lorian Drevac's expanded investigation into employment records throughout Colorado Territory had uncovered the true scope of the network's infiltration into the region's power structure. Over the past 3 years, domestic workers with similar backgrounds and skill sets had found positions in the households of every major mining operation, territorial official, military contractor, and banking representative in the region. These placements followed patterns that suggested careful strategic planning rather than coincidental job-seeking by individual workers. Families known for particularly brutal treatment of employees had received new kitchen staff within weeks of previous workers' departures. Households involved in territorial politics had gained cleaning staff who possessed unusually advanced language skills and demonstrated remarkable memory for overheard conversations. Most disturbing of all, several families had unknowingly employed multiple network members simultaneously, creating situations where their most private communications were being monitored by people who had every reason to gather intelligence about their employers' activities and associations. The breakthrough that revealed the network's true leadership came when Corvane traced the employment recommendations that had helped these workers secure their positions. The letters of reference all contained subtle similarities in phrasing and structure that suggested common authorship, despite bearing the signatures of different territorial officials and business leaders. Careful analysis revealed that the recommendations had been written by someone with intimate knowledge of territorial government procedures, access to official stationery and seals, and detailed understanding of the personal relationships between Colorado's political and economic elite. The forger was not some criminal operating on the margins of society, but someone embedded within the very institutions they were working to undermine. The identity of this inside collaborator became clear when Corvane discovered a pattern in the timing of the forged recommendations. Each batch of false documents had been produced immediately following meetings of the Territorial Council, the governing body that included representatives from major mining operations, territorial officials, and appointed delegates from various communities throughout Colorado. Someone with regular access to Territorial Council meetings was using information gathered during official sessions to facilitate the placement of network operatives in strategic positions throughout the region. The conspiracy reached directly into the heart of Colorado Territory's government structure. From Marshal Therick Corvane's confidential report to Territorial Governor Sylvan Moorish, June 18, 1852, the evidence suggests a coordinated resistance movement with operational capabilities that rival military organizations. Network members have infiltrated household staffs throughout the territory, established communication systems across vast geographic areas, and compromised the security of our governmental operations through collaboration with highly placed inside sources. But the most shocking revelation came when Corvane cross-referenced the timing of suspicious deaths with the schedule of Territorial Council meetings. Every major incident, the Thalvin heart attack, the Van Roe mine collapse, the Cresttown trading post fire, and the Corraith wedding massacre, had occurred within 2 weeks of council sessions where territorial labor policies had been discussed. Someone was using official government meetings to identify targets for elimination, gathering intelligence about planned changes in territorial law that might affect worker conditions, and coordinating strikes against opponents of labor reform before they could implement their policies. The network was not simply responding to individual acts of cruelty or exploitation. They were waging strategic warfare against the entire system of territorial governance that protected the interests of mining companies at the expense of worker safety and human dignity. The Chinese miner Kaylor Vinreth's revelations about the underground transportation network provided the final pieces of a conspiracy puzzle that stretched across the entire American West. Under careful questioning, Vinreth revealed that the mountain communication system connected not just Colorado Territory, but mining regions throughout California, Nevada, Utah, and the Dakota Territories. Workers who had been disappeared from Colorado operations were surfacing in new positions hundreds of miles away, carrying with them detailed intelligence about mining techniques, territorial policies, and the personal habits of wealthy families throughout the region. The network was not just facilitating escapes. It was conducting systematic espionage operations against the entire Western mining industry. "They know everything," Vinrith explained during his protected testimony. "They know which families hurt workers, which officials take money from mining companies, which military officers help catch runaway workers. They know because they have people everywhere, and those people, they remember everything they see and hear." The network's intelligence-gathering capabilities explained how they had been able to coordinate simultaneous operations across vast distances, ensure the security of their communication systems, and stay ahead of law enforcement efforts to track their activities. They possessed better information about territorial operations than the officials supposedly in charge of governing the region. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that this network had been operational for years before anyone in territorial government had recognized its existence. The deaths, disappearances, and accidents that had been attributed to the normal hazards of frontier life were actually evidence of a sophisticated organization that had been systematically eliminating obstacles to their goals while remaining completely invisible to official oversight. Mirelle Corvane faced the unsettling conclusion that he was not investigating a criminal conspiracy. He was discovering a shadow government that had been operating parallel to territorial authority, with its own system of justice, communication, and enforcement that served the interests of workers rather than the employers who officially controlled Colorado's economic and political structures. The question was no longer who had killed the Corraith family, but how deeply this network had penetrated territorial society and what they planned to do with the power they had accumulated through years of patient infiltration and careful preparation. As night fell over the Colorado mountains, Mirelle Corvane realized that everything he thought he knew about frontier law and order had been an illusion maintained by people who possessed the real power to determine who lived, who died, and how territorial society would ultimately be structured. The network was about to reveal itself more fully, and the revelation would challenge every assumption about power, justice, and resistance in the American West. The stone church of St. Augustine sat perched on a granite outcropping overlooking Golden Valley like a medieval fortress adapted for frontier worship, its bell tower visible from mining camps 30 miles away. Built with the same unforgiving craftsmanship that characterized everything in Colorado territory, the church served not only as a place of worship, but as the unofficial center of territorial intellectual life, housing the region's only substantial library, and serving as meeting place for the various educational and charitable organizations that provided what little social services existed in the mining territories. Father Arendor Valtryk had arrived in Colorado territory in 1849, carrying credentials from the University of Dublin and a reputation for scholarly work that had made him welcome among the educated elite who controlled territorial society. His sermons drew capacity crowds not just because of religious devotion, but because the Irish priest possessed the kind of classical education that frontier communities desperately craved, offering intellectual stimulation that was otherwise unavailable in mining camps and trading posts. What Marshal Therick Corvane discovered during his investigation would reveal that Father Valtryk's scholarly reputation concealed the most sophisticated resistance operation in American frontier history, a network that had transformed churches, schools, and charitable organizations throughout the Western territories into recruitment centers and training facilities for individuals dedicated to dismantling the economic system that had made their oppression possible. The breakthrough came when Corvane traced the mineral signatures found in the mysterious correspondence with Malven Corraith. Dr. Visira Halcourt's chemical analysis had identified specific trace elements that could only be found in the ink used by scribes who worked with the rare books and manuscripts housed in St. Augustine's library. Someone with regular access to the church's scholarly resources had been conducting the negotiations that preceded the Corraith family's execution. But it was the timing of Father Valtryk's travels throughout Colorado territory that provided the most damning evidence. Church records showed that the priest had conducted religious services and educational seminars in every location where suspicious deaths had occurred, usually within weeks of the incidents that eliminated key figures from the territorial power structure. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Father Valtryk had been present in Broken Creek 3 days before the Thalvin Patriarch's fatal heart attack. He had conducted a memorial service for deceased miners at the Van Roe operation just 2 weeks before the cave-in that killed the owner and his sons. His educational seminars at the Cresttown trading post had concluded barely a month before the fire that consumed the entire family. From Marshal Therick Corvin's confidential investigation notes, June 20, 1852, Father Valtrick's travel schedule corresponds precisely with the timeline of suspicious deaths throughout the territory. His presence in each location suggests either remarkable coincidence or direct involvement in coordinating the elimination of prominent territorial figures. Given the sophistication of the operations we have uncovered, coincidence seems unlikely. The investigation of St. Augustine's Church revealed the true scope of the educational network that had been operating under the cover of religious and charitable activities. Hidden beneath the main sanctuary, accessible through a concealed entrance behind the altar, Corvane discovered a complex of underground chambers that had been carved directly from the mountain granite. These chambers contained the most extensive library of botanical, chemical, and medical knowledge that Corvane had ever encountered outside of major universities. Shelves lined with carefully preserved books on plant identification, poison extraction techniques, human anatomy, and chemical analysis stretched through multiple rooms that had been excavated with the same precision used in the valley's most sophisticated mining operations. But the library was only part of the facility's purpose. Adjacent chambers contained laboratory equipment that would have been impressive in major eastern cities. Distillation apparatus for extracting plant essences, precision scales for measuring chemical compounds, microscopes for examining botanical specimens, and reference collections of preserved plant and mineral samples from throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Dr. Halcourt's examination of the laboratory revealed evidence of systematic research and development work that had been conducted over a period of years. Test records documented experiments with various plant combinations, dosage calculations for different body weights and ages, and timing studies that determined how long different toxins required to take effect under various conditions. This is not the work of individual criminals seeking revenge, Dr. Halcourt reported after spending 2 days examining the facility. This is an institutional research program designed to develop and refine techniques for systematic assassination. The level of scientific rigor and documentation suggests academic training and substantial financial resources. The recruitment records hidden in Father Valtrick's personal chambers revealed how ordinary domestic workers had been transformed into deadly operatives capable of eliminating territorial elite while avoiding detection by law enforcement. The process began with identification of individuals who possessed both motive for resistance and access to potential targets. Father Valtrick had used his position as a trusted spiritual advisor to identify workers who had suffered particular cruelties at the hands of their employers, people whose families had been destroyed by mining accidents or exploitative labor practices, individuals whose cultural backgrounds had been systematically degraded by the territorial elite who claimed to represent Christian civilization. The priest's recruitment approach was subtle, beginning with religious counseling that helped potential operatives understand their suffering in terms of broader social justice rather than individual misfortune. Bible study sessions explored themes of liberation, resistance to oppression, and the moral obligations of those who witnessed injustice. From Father Arendor Valtrick's personal recruitment notes, discovered in his private quarters, Thessia possesses the intelligence and determination necessary for advanced training, but her emotional wounds require careful healing before she can be trusted with dangerous responsibilities. Her Cherokee heritage provides botanical knowledge that could be valuable, but her desire for personal revenge must be channeled into commitment to broader justice. The training program that transformed recruits like Thessia into effective operatives combined religious instruction, academic education, and practical skill development in ways that created individuals capable of operating independently while maintaining loyalty to the network's larger objectives. Religious training emphasized the moral framework that justified violence against oppressors, drawing on biblical examples of divine justice and liberation theology that portrayed resistance against exploitation as religious obligation. Recruits learned to understand their actions not as criminal behavior, but as participation in a holy war against systems that denied human dignity to workers and minorities. Academic education provided the scientific knowledge necessary for sophisticated assassination techniques. Recruits studied botany, chemistry, anatomy, and pharmacology using textbooks that Father Valtrick had obtained from universities throughout the United States and Europe. The priest's scholarly reputation allowed him to acquire advanced educational materials without arousing suspicion about their ultimate purpose. Practical training took place in the laboratory chambers beneath St. Augustine's Church, where recruits learned to identify poisonous plants, extract active compounds, calculate proper dosages, and develop delivery methods that would avoid detection. The training emphasized precision, patience, and the importance of making deaths appear natural rather than obviously criminal. But perhaps the most important aspect of the program was the development of operational security skills that allowed network members to coordinate activities across vast distances while avoiding detection by law enforcement. Recruits learned codes for written communication, techniques for concealing evidence, methods for establishing false identities, and procedures for evacuating compromised areas. The network's communication system relied on a combination of religious and academic contacts that allowed information to move across the Western Territories through channels that appeared completely legitimate to outside observers. Father Valtric's correspondence with other priests, teachers, and scholars provided cover for intelligence sharing that coordinated network operations from California to the Dakota Territories. Thessia's specific training records revealed the painstaking process through which a traumatized young woman had been transformed into an instrument of calculated justice. Her initial recruitment had occurred during her second year at Ironcliff Manor, when Father Valtric had visited to conduct religious services for the household staff. The priest had identified Thessia as a potential recruit through careful observation of her behavior during religious services and private conversations about her family's destruction during the Cherokee removal. Her intelligence, her botanical knowledge inherited from her mother's people, and her access to the Corraith family's domestic routines made her an ideal candidate for the network's purposes. Her training had required 2 years of careful preparation, during which she learned to extract cardiac glycosides from foxglove and oleander, calculate dosages based on body weight and consumption patterns, and develop delivery methods that would ensure lethal results while avoiding immediate detection. But equally important was her psychological preparation for the role she would eventually play. Father Valtric's notes documented sessions designed to help Thessia understand her personal suffering as part of a larger pattern of oppression, to channel her desire for individual revenge into commitment to systematic change, and to prepare her emotionally for the consequences of mass murder. The priest's final assessment of Thessia's readiness revealed the cold calculation that characterized the network's operations. Subject demonstrates complete commitment to network objectives and possesses technical skills necessary for complex operations. Recommend deployment against high-value targets when opportunity presents itself. Subject's emotional investment in eliminating the Corraith family makes her ideal for assignment to their household. The network's most disturbing capability was its ability to place trained operatives in strategic positions years before they would be activated for specific missions. Thessia had worked in the Corraith kitchen for 4 years, establishing trust and developing detailed knowledge of family routines before receiving the order to eliminate her employers. This long-term approach allowed network members to gather extensive intelligence about their targets, develop sophisticated assassination plans, and establish escape routes that would ensure their survival after completing their missions. The patience and discipline required for such operations indicated organizational sophistication that surpassed anything territorial law enforcement had previously encountered. As Mirelle Corvane studied the evidence he had uncovered in St. Augustine's underground facility, he realized that he was confronting something unprecedented in American frontier history, a resistance movement that combined religious authority, academic resources, and operational security to wage systematic war against the territorial power structure. Father Arendor Valtric had created an organization capable of identifying, training, and deploying operatives throughout the Western Territories, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate religious and educational activities. The network possessed better intelligence about territorial operations than official government agencies, superior technical capabilities than territorial law enforcement, and more effective communication systems than the political organizations that supposedly governed Colorado Territory. But the most unsettling discovery was yet to come. Hidden among Father Valtric's personal papers, Mirelle Corvane would find evidence that the network's ultimate objective was not simply the elimination of individual cruel employers, but the complete transformation of territorial society through systematic replacement of existing power structures with institutions controlled by the workers and minorities who had been excluded from political participation. The assassination of the Corraith family was not an isolated act of revenge. It was the opening phase of a revolution. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.